Hello, MOOC participants. I'm here with Dr. Marie Farrow from the Wicking Dementia Centre. Now, the Wicking Centre does have another MOOC in the area of risk factors for dementia, and that's called the Preventing Dementia MOOC, which will also be available for you to participate in for the future. But today, we thought we would go over the basics of the major risk factors for dementia. Sometimes when we talk about risk factors for dementia, we talk about modifiable and non-modifiable factors for dementia. Marie, can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so as the plain English interpretation of those words suggests, non-modifiable factors are the ones that we can't change. So we're going to talk a little bit about the major ones of those, which are ageing and our genetics. And then modifiable risk factors are the ones that we can potentially do something about to perhaps reduce our risk of developing dementia.
The major non-modifiable risk factor for dementia is ageing. Essentially, the older you are, the greater risk you have of developing dementia. Particularly when you get up into your late 70s and into your 80s, it would seem again that your risk of developing dementia is much higher. It's been estimated that around about 25% of people in their mid-80s would have dementia. And indeed, in fact, if you went looking for the brain pathologies that link with the diseases that cause dementia, probably a good proportion of the remaining number of people would have some of those brain changes as well, and maybe subtle functional behavioural deficits. The other big risk factor is genetics. So Marie, do you want to tell us a little bit more about the genetics of dementia?
The genetics of dementia is very complex and we don't yet fully understand it. But over the last decade or so, we've learned a great deal, and so we know that in a few cases there are genetic mutations that actually cause dementia. So for a very small number of families, they can actually inherit a gene mutation that will cause them to develop Alzheimer's disease or frontotemporal dementia or another form of dementia. But for the vast majority of cases, probably at least 95 to 99% of cases of dementia, there's no specific gene that causes it. But there are risk genes. So some of us inherit genes from our parents that might increase our risk of developing dementia, but then we also inherit other genes that might decrease our risk of developing dementia.
So amongst those genes, we know that there's one particular gene that comes in variations that seems to be responsible for most of this risk that is linked to what we call sporadic versions of dementia. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so it's a gene that we call ApoE, which stands for the apolipoprotein E. So it's a normal gene that we all carry, and it produces a normal protein that we all need in our bodies and our brains. And it comes in variations. So some of us have a variation that seems to be associated with an increased risk of developing Alzheimer's disease in particular, and perhaps also vascular dementia. So if we have this particular variation, and there are about 20% of people in the population who do, we have perhaps double the chance of developing dementia compared to people who don't have that. But it is just a risk factor. It doesn't mean that we will definitely develop dementia. And in fact, there are many people who do develop Alzheimer's disease who don't carry that gene variation. So it's just one of those things that might increase our risk.
Thanks, Marie.
I'm going to move on to talk about the modifiable risk factors for dementia. And there was a study that was published a couple of years ago, James, that looked at how much of dementia might be attributed to some of the modifiable risk factors. And they concluded that perhaps around 30% of cases of Alzheimer's disease might be preventable if we were to eliminate these risk factors from the population. Now, obviously, we can't eliminate them completely, but we can certainly perhaps reduce their prevalence. And we know from studies like this that that would have a really significant impact on the number of people who develop dementia into the future. So in this particular study, they identified 7 risk factors that they felt had the most consistent evidence of an association with increasing the risk of developing dementia. And we're going to talk about some of those in more detail. One of the first ones that they identified, one of the ones that has perhaps a very large impact in the population, is that of low educational levels. James, can you tell us some more about that?
Yes, certainly, and that's one that we're obviously interested in because we work in an educational institution. And basically taking on board a number of studies that have been in this area, some very big epidemiological studies where they study populations of people. What we seem to know is that the more years of education you have earlier in life, particularly up to year 12, the lower your chance of developing dementia in later life. So there is something about what happens to your brain in those early years of life and perhaps the potential effects of education on the brain that might help provide some protection. This brings into play another feature that we often talk about in terms of risk, which is the area of cognitive reserve.
Yes.
So there's an idea again that if you have a lifetime of complex mental stimulation, which could include education, for example, but could be other factors, then again your risk of developing dementia later in life might be lower. And the theory of cognitive reserve basically says that irrespective or taking into account the pathology that might start to be building up inside your brain, if you've got more pathways or redundant pathways within the brain or better ways of using those pathways, then you might be able to compensate for that pathology, and so your functional decline may be delayed. So again, it doesn't mean that you might not get dementia, but that if you were to go and get it, then it would be delayed months or years.
Yeah, I find that a really exciting aspect of the risk factors and the research in this area that we're talking about, that we can potentially delay the onset of a dementia in the face of our brain developing something like Alzheimer's disease.
Yes. And I guess and one of the other factors that we hear about amongst those 7 factors, which probably relates to some aspect of brain health, is depression. And I know you know a lot about this particular area of epidemiological research.
It's a very complex area, the relationship between dementia and depression, because we know that people who experience dementia have a higher risk of experiencing depression as well. The two seem to go together. And it may be the case that for some people who are developing dementia, depression might in fact be a very early sign of the changes that are going on in the brain and an early manifestation of them developing dementia. And the research certainly seems to bear that out. But what the research is also showing now is that if you have a history of depression at some point in your life, you have on average a higher risk of developing dementia later on. So depression seems to be, although we still need to do a lot more work in this area to understand the relationship fully, but it seems to be both a risk factor for dementia and potentially a sign of dementia as well.
And then we have a cluster of factors. The other 5 factors may well be related to each other in some way. Sometimes we refer to these as the physical factors. And I sometimes have difficulty remembering them all, so I'll count them on my fingers, but there's low physical activity,
Yes.
midlife hypertension, obesity,
Smoking,
thank you very much, and diabetes as
Yes.
well too. We could talk about diabetes a little bit more at the end, but perhaps with those first 4 factors, Marie, if you can tell us a little bit more about those.
So physical activity is an area that has emerged as being quite an important risk factor. So we all know that physical activity is good for our bodies and it's good for our hearts. The research evidence is now very clear that it's also good for our brains. So people who remain regularly physically active have a lower chance of developing dementia. They also have better cognitive function. So if we, at any age, if we test people's memories and other cognitive function, it seems to be better for those who are physically active. And one of the main reasons for that may be that our brain actually uses quite a large proportion of our blood supply, and it needs a good, healthy vascular system, and physical activity is one way that we can keep our vascular system healthy.
And I mentioned in the first unit of the MOOC how even with the major neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's disease, Lewy body dementia and frontotemporal dementia, there may well be a vascular component.
That's right.
So that might erode your ability of your brain to perhaps respond to that pathology, or in some cases might even drive some of that pathology.
Yes, one of the ways that I sometimes explain it is that if I happen to have Alzheimer's disease in my brain, and then I also have bad vascular health and in fact vascular disease in my brain, then I'm much more likely to experience dementia if I've got those two things affecting my brain function at the same time.
So it sort of heightens your vulnerability.
That's right.
To a degree. The last factor that we know that is amongst these 7 major factors is diabetes. And that's one where the literature, I think, and the research is still playing out. So there's a view with diabetes that may well be affecting vascular health, and that may be where it plays out in terms of your risk of dementia. But there are also some really interesting ideas about how related signalling molecules such as insulin may be directly affecting nerve cells or affecting some of the pathology of dementia. So that's another one where we probably have to watch how the research evolves over time, but we do know that having diabetes does provide increased risk of developing dementia.
That's right, and one of the important things to mention, of course, is that many people have high blood pressure, high cholesterol, diabetes. They're very common conditions in our society. So the important thing is that they are treated and managed really effectively. So we can encourage people to make sure they have regular checkups to detect these conditions, because often they have no symptoms. So you might have diabetes and not even know about it unless you go and get your blood glucose checked very regularly. So people need to have checkups, detect the conditions if they occur, and if they do, make sure they're treated and managed as effectively as possible, because that's not only going to benefit their heart health and their future risk of heart disease, but also their brain health and future risk of dementia.
So that's the good news about at least identifying these 7 major risk factors, is that they are potentially modifiable.
Yeah.
And as you say, maybe by managing those factors in midlife, and sometimes very early in life, we may be able to mitigate our risk of developing dementia later in life.
That's right. If we can keep our brains as healthy as possible for as long as possible, we can hopefully delay the onset of dementia at least.
Thank you very much, Maureen.
Thank you, James.